and I have worked at Fallingwater now for 34 years. Fallingwater is owned and operated by the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. We're a private, nonprofit, basically a small nature conservancy in Western Pennsylvania based out of Pittsburgh. And I started working for the Conservancy in 1986, in August of 1986, 1 month before Fallingwater celebrated its 50th anniversary. And in fact, one of the first opportunities that I had was to work the 50th anniversary celebration that Edgar Kaufman Jr. had planned. And so that was quite a special experience. And I've now also attended our 75th anniversary as well. I've worked mostly in the education department. I've worked as a guide. I have managed our school programs. I also worked in, we have a residency program where we bring high school students, college students, and teachers onto the site for a week-long residency, so I've worked in that. Currently, I do manage school programs and also outreach. And for a number of years, my husband also worked here as well, and he worked in our preservation department. And that's been very helpful to me because it's helped me understand things about construction that I probably would not have known. So would you like me to go ahead and start the program at this point? Okay. So this is a photograph taken by Andrew Peelage, and Andrew Peelage is a wonderful photographer that is working his way through every single Frank Lloyd Wright structure that exists in the United States. He wants to photograph all of them. He was our scholar in residence about, I believe it's about 3 years ago, and this photograph was taken during that time. So I'll go ahead and get started with just the basic history, which is that Frank Lloyd Wright was 68 when he designed Fallingwater. So he'd been working actually 40-some years at that point, so he was very well established. This was in 1934 that he was commissioned to actually design the home. He started as an architect in his 20s. So he had been working, as I said, for roughly 40 years, had designed over 200 buildings by this point, and yet he would design way over 200 more after Fallingwater was completed. And as far as the number of works that Frank Lloyd Wright designed, I do have a number listed there. You can Google that and actually come up with a couple of different numbers depending on what source you choose, but it's something a little over 1,000 projects that he designed. Not all of those were built. There were around 500 structures actually built, so there were a lot of unbuilt projects. So he was commissioned by Edgar and Lillian Kaufman and also their adult son, Edgar Kaufman Jr., to design what was going to be a vacation home for them. Edgar and Lillian Kaufman owned Kaufman Department Store that you see pictured there, which was in downtown Pittsburgh. The Kaufmans lived just outside of the city of Pittsburgh. They had an 18-room Normand estate in a lovely suburb of Pittsburgh where a lot of wealthy, fashionable families lived at that time, called Fox Chapel. However, like a lot of Pittsburghers, they wanted to escape the city quite frequently on weekends. And the reason for doing so was that it had to do with the conditions in Pittsburgh in the 1930s. Pittsburgh was still the smoky steel city. And in fact, pollution was so bad that streetlights came on during the day. It was actually that dark. And that upper photo does show you Pittsburgh in the 1930s, and you can see some of the smog there in the background. Anybody could get out of the city wanted to. And there was an area of the state that was really easy to access, and a lot of Pittsburghers started to vacation in that region. And it was a section of the state down in the lower corner, left-hand corner, and that's called an area called the Laurel Highlands. We were very much like what the Catskills were to New York City. And one of the reasons for that is that it was easy to get here. The railroads beginning in the 1880s. Rail lines were built that connected this corner of the state to Pittsburgh. Railroads followed the rivers, and that linked us. And it made travel out here really easy. You can get here in maybe about 2 hours on a train and come out for $1 a day. Now, I have some photos there in the lower corner of a little town just south of where Fallingwater was built. It's only 5 miles from us. That's where the rail lines came in, and it was called Ohiopyle. And from really about the late 1880s on, Ohiopyle became a big place for people to vacation. There were 4 huge hotels. There were lots of cabins in this region. So it wasn't unusual that Edgar and Lillian Kaufman would start looking for property out here in the mountains because everybody was looking for property out here. Now, what they started thinking about was perhaps building some type of summer camp for their store employees. And that was an idea that was not unique to them. In fact, I have some photos of another camp just outside of Pittsburgh called Camp Horn, and this was actually run by Horn's department store. So other department stores ran summer camps at the time, other businesses ran them. They were often accessible by train, but not always, but train travel certainly made them easy and economical for most people to access them. In this case, the Kaufmans were able to find property that had at one time been a Masonic camp. And when they bought it in 1916, it was not pristine wilderness. It came with a lodge, which is what you see in the upper photo. Actually, the bottom photo is the same lodge, but it's a different view of it, so the building looks a little bit different. That lodge had enough room for 70 beds. This property, they purchased about 1,900 acres. There were tennis courts, there was a bowling alley, there was a dance pavilion, lots of individual small cabins. So it was not pristine wilderness. They bought an established camp, and they began from 1916 on to the early 1930s to run Kaufman's summer camp. You could buy in for $7 a week and come out and enjoy some of the various activities that they had on the property. And Edgar and Lillian found that coming out here to the Bear Run property was something that they very much valued and enjoyed as well. And in fact, in 1923, they would also build a cabin on the property. And it was a small, very basic cabin. They actually ordered it from a catalog, not Sears, but from a company called Aladdin. And it did not have running water. It did not have any indoor heat. So it was just really a place for summer vacations. And they slept on screened-in porches around the sides. They did add on to it a little bit in the very, very late 20s, early 30s. They added one little other wing on, and that's what we're seeing the inside of. And the Kaufmans are shown here in this photograph. In fact, Edgar Sr. is in the upper table staring just straight ahead at us. Mrs. Kaufman, Lillian Kaufman, has a dog on her lap, one of the long-haired Dachshunds that the family bred. And then Edgar Jr. is actually just behind her, just facing towards the camera. So many of the store executives also had cabins on the property, and coming out here was something the Kaufmans really, really enjoyed. But they did find by the early 30s that they would like to upgrade a little bit. They couldn't come in the winter, obviously, and that was something they would like to do. And they would like to have something a little bit larger because they really did want to be able to entertain out here. Another big change that actually impacted the summer camp and would impact the Kaufmans' decision to build a larger home on the property was that by the 30s, the automobile was becoming more popular. And that meant that reliance on train travel certainly wasn't something that people needed to do. So therefore, summer camps and the way people vacationed changed. Summer camps were not as popular. And so the Kaufmans made the decision in the early part of the 30s that they were going to begin looking for an architect. And in 1934, their son, who was in his 20s, had read Frank Lloyd Wright's autobiography. He really wasn't looking to become an architect, but he was interested in Frank Lloyd Wright's ideas, because Wright was talking about a unique idea, which is that America needed its own architecture. We should not copy styles from Europe. We needed to design buildings that fit each individual landscape, that fit each client's needs. So there should be as many different types of buildings as there were different types of people. So the Kaufmans had gone out to Wright's school to visit their son, Taliesin, out in Wisconsin, and they talked with Frank Lloyd Wright about the possibility of a vacation home commission. And Mr. Kaufman also mentioned the possibility of some civic projects for the city of Pittsburgh, because civic planning was something that he was actually quite involved in and quite interested in. So, oh, I'm sorry about that. I actually forgot that I had the circles around the Kaufman faces. So you can actually see Edgar Kaufman Sr., Lillian, and Edgar Kaufman Jr. Circled there in blue. This is a photograph taken probably during the summer camp days and shows you what the waterfall looked like before the house was built. Frank Lloyd Wright would have seen this type of view when the Kaufmans brought him out here. And the first time that he came here was actually in December of '34. And the family talked about wanting to be near the falls. And Frank Lloyd Wright talked them into this idea that they had not considered at all, which was the idea of living with the waterfall. And that really took them aback. That took them by surprise. But I think the more they thought about it, especially Edgar Sr., he got very, very excited about the idea of actually being on top of that waterfall. And what Wright designed was a building that took its inspiration from the shape of the rock ledges that created the falls. So the various horizontal levels of the building were Wright's version of those horizontal rock ledges that actually created the falls. 3-story building. Sections of it are suspended out forward, almost like the way a diving board extends out and doesn't have vertical support. So the building uses what we call cantilever construction, which is a diving board, basically. You can see in that image on the right that the front part of the building is suspended out along the front. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that actually works. The materials were relatively simple. Reinforced concrete forms the various horizontal levels of the building. Basically anything you see painted that kind of peachy beige color is concrete. Metal, steel formed all of the windows and door frames. Stone that they took from the property. They built the main house roughly in about a year and a half. So finished the main house around 1937. But from the beginning, the Kaufmans had talked to Frank Lloyd Wright about the fact that someday they would need more. They were going to need guest quarters eventually. They would need also staff quarters. So the commission, they did intend for it to grow. So 1938, they asked Wright to come back, go ahead and do drawings for a guest house, for staff quarters. And that building is built on the hillside behind the main house. It was built roughly in about 10 months in '39. The entire project was $155,000. A lot of money back then. An average 3-bedroom brick house in Pittsburgh was maybe $5,000. So it was a lot for a vacation home. This is a section drawing. So it's basically cutting through the building. But I think it's a good illustration to look at the way the loads are placed on the building in the form of where all of the stone, where all of the masonry is in the building. It's all placed on the back side of the house. And what that does is, with all of that heavy stone on the back end of the building, that weights the back of the building down and balances the front of the house up and out over the falls. You can build a really simple cantilever if you take a book and push it out over the edge of the desk until it's about to tip. Place your hand on the back of it, and that will weight the back end of it down. Although you really need a book that is very stiff and very rigid. It's not going to work if you use a magazine that's really flimsy. It's got to be a material that's stiff and rigid, but really any hardbound book should work. So that's why reinforced concrete worked. The steel reinforcing rods and the concrete added the tensile strength and the rigidity that the concrete lacked. And then the weight of the masonry on the back weighted the back of the building down. I have a couple of construction shots. I think those are always kind of interesting to look at. So it's a view taken just from below the falls, and we're looking at the foundation being put in. And so on the far end on the left is a stone wall, and then next to that, moving over to the right, there are 3 concrete, Wright called them bolsters. The shape is rather narrow at the base where it's built on top of the falls, and then it sort of widens out where it attaches to the underside of the first floor. So there are 4, Wright also said, fingers basically that support the first floor. That first floor is about 10 feet above that bedrock of the waterfall, if you're kind of wondering how far above the top of the falls we are. And these are interesting. Of course, the shot in the bottom, you can see at that point, a lot of the scaffolding is still in place. In the upper shot, they've removed quite a bit of it. But in that lower shot, Edgar Kaufman Sr. is standing there, and this is taken from below the falls. So he's actually looking at the house under construction, and I wonder what he must have been thinking at that point. In the upper photo, while a lot of the scaffolding has been removed, they've also stripped away a lot of the formwork. All of the concrete for the building would have been poured in place. So they had concrete mixers kind of up on the hill, up in the back, and then they dumped that concrete into either wheelbarrows or into chutes. And each level of the house would have been 1 pour. So the entire first floor and the walls of the terrace, that's all 1 pour. Once they took the formwork off and had all of the scaffolding off, they smoothed over the concrete by putting a stucco coat over it, and that was all hand applied. And then everything was painted. And pretty amazing, all of that finished in about 1.5 years, because they did not use any concrete trucks or huge concrete pumpers out here. They basically had 2 to 3 small gasoline mixers that they were using at any one time. And the crew, by the way, was local. By the time they started construction on Fallingwater, the public works programs of the 30s had already hired out of the area most people that had masonry training. They had a couple of skilled stonemasons, but this whole project was not built by masons. A lot of it was built by gentlemen that didn't have training in masonry but learned it here on this project, and some of them went on to have a lifetime in construction and masonry after that. Others continued to work on farms in the area, but many of them have descendants who now work here at Fallingwater as it's open as a museum. A couple of more construction shots. These are taken from over on the bridge. So if you've ever come to Fallingwater, when you first start your tour, we started on the bridge. You walk down the driveway, and this is the view that you actually see as you approach the building, is this side, this east side of the building. So you can see there's kind of those 2 shots are, the house is in various stages of construction. Not all of the formwork has been removed. In fact, in the shot in the upper left-hand photo, they don't have all of the 3rd floor poured yet. It is in the lower photo. I can just barely see the roof roll on the 3rd floor, but none of the windows are framed in yet at this point. Masonry is all done in that lower photo at that stage. And in this photo, they're actually dressing stone, and that was taken in the quarry, which is not very far from the house. There was an old stone quarry on the property. It was roughly about 500 feet from where they were going to build, and probably supplied stone for a lot of the little cottages that had been built on the property. Mr. Kaufman knew it was there. And after he first saw plans for the building, it was in actually in the late fall, but he was so excited that he asked Frank Lloyd Wright if they could go ahead and open up the quarry and start setting stone aside. And so what Wright instructed him to have the workmen do was to cut it into certain lengths. He gave them very specific lengths he wanted them to stack it in, but to not change the width of the stone, to take it out in whatever width that stone bedded. This is a kind of sandstone called Pottsville. That's the formation, and it forms in both very thin and thick layers. So in this photo, that's on the photo on the left is a sandstone cliff that's along the stream Bear Run, just actually before you get to the house. But you can see the layers in the stone, and you can see some of the different thicknesses, and then look at the masonry on the right. And I think what you notice is that Wright really was looking to nature as the inspiration as to how he wanted them to lay the stone at Fallingwater. He wanted thick and thin layers, so he wanted pieces sticking in and out, very much just the way it's found in that natural cliff there on the left-hand side. Now those flat stones that you see along the bottom where those are stacked up, those are pavers. Those are, they chose the thinner stones for paving any of the floors inside and then also on the terraces. Now you use your thinner sandstone for that. And a couple of finished shots of the interior. The first floor is the space that afforded the Kaufmans the entertaining space that they had wanted. It's 1,800 square feet, very different layout from what most families lived in the 30s, which were rooms that were all divided by walls. Here, the Kaufmans had a living room, dining room, music area, study, all combined into one space. And they had two terraces which opened up on either end of the living room that they could also entertain on. In fact, they often enjoyed eating a lot of their meals out on the terraces. Wright designed all of the built-in furniture. He also designed a lot of the freestanding pieces you can see too, like the coffee tables and those small, low seats and the little stools. And those also added kind of a rustic element to the building, or a sense of informality, which was something the Kaufmans very much wanted. Also adding kind of a rustic element was the idea of adding the fir throws, which the Kaufmans did, and keeping most of the floors bare, not having wall-to-wall carpeting, just adding area rugs here and there. Fallingwater was more about a casual style of living. This was a place where they came to enjoy nature, to entertain their friends. But when they were here, you know, activities were things like hiking and fishing and swimming. They did have cocktail parties and costume parties and things when they were here, but by and large, the entertaining was far more casual in style. I like this shot. This is a black and white shot. It's an early shot that was taken, I believe, in the 50s, if I remember right. But you can see the guest house up behind the main house there on the hillside. So this was added, as I mentioned, 1939. So you're seeing all of the main building and then the guest house up behind it. And you can also see the bridge too, there in the kind of on the right-hand side. And that's what you drive across when you come down towards the house. And a shot of the Kaufmans actually utilizing Fallingwater. In the upper photo, there next to the Bodhisattva is sitting in a butterfly chair is the companion of Edgar Kaufman Jr., Paul Mayen. He was a well-noted designer in his own right, and he also designed the visitor center here at Fallingwater. Next to him is one of the members of the Spire family. They lived in the area in Pittsburgh, also had a vacation cabin out here in the area too. And also then another member of the Spire family. The gentleman in blue that's standing is actually Edgar Kaufman Jr. Edgar and Lillian Kaufman
Sophie.
died in the early 1950s.
Sophie.
Lillian first in 1952, and then Edgar Kaufman Sr. in 1955. And that's Edgar and Lillian in that upper photo on the right. Lillian's seated there on the edge of the master terrace, Edgar Sr. beside her. The photo in the upper left-hand corner is Edgar Sr. on the left, Edgar Jr. in the center, and then Lillian. Photo in the lower corner on the left-hand side, Edgar Sr. seated with one of the long-haired dachshunds on his lap, and then Lillian Kaufman is next to him in the chair. And I believe that's also Edgar Jr. then in the chair closest to the camera, but it's a little difficult to see the side of his face, so I'm not sure. Lillian is also shown in the photograph on the lower right, and she is seated on the couch and she is in red, so she's in the center there in that photograph. Lillian died in 1952, Edgar Sr. in 1955, and Edgar Kaufman Jr. and Edgar Sr. had talked about the future of Fallingwater. By the late 50s, Edgar Kaufman Jr. had been working in New York City for a number of years. In fact, he had left Pennsylvania for New York in the early 1940s and become a curator at the Museum of Modern Art, where he worked for a number of years. And he continued after his father died in 1955 to own Fallingwater and to vacation here. But he knew that it was his parents' wish that at some point Fallingwater be open to the public. And so in 1963, he entrusted Fallingwater to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. And I have a photo of that designation here that I'll show you in just a moment. But he started working, Edgar Kaufman Jr. started working for the Museum of Modern Art in 1938, actually started an association with them, I should say. The photo that's in the lower right-hand corner that says A New House by Frank Lloyd Wright is an exhibit catalog from an exhibit that MoMA was promoting on Fallingwater in 1938. And what's interesting about that is Fallingwater was a year old at that point, and MoMA was mounting a solo exhibit on it. That was a really unusual circumstance. Also, to the left, the Time magazine cover, a lot of people are familiar with that. It's a rather famous cover of Frank Lloyd Wright with the render of Fallingwater in the background. That's 1938. Wright, his career rebounded. It had been slow during the 30s. The Depression had a major impact on it. Also, America was focusing quite a bit on a lot of European architects who were becoming popular here in the States. Well, between Fallingwater, the Johnson Wax Building, and several other really big projects in the mid-30s, Wright went on to design like another 200 buildings after Fallingwater. And he was almost 92 when he died in 1959. And then Edgar Kaufman Jr. Worked for MoMA for a number of years. He also taught art and architectural history at Columbia. And it was in '63 that he made the decision to open Fallingwater to the public. And this is a photo actually taken at the dedication. So that happened in October of 1963. And then in 1964 is when the house officially opened for tours. The idea to give Fallingwater to basically a nature conservancy was rather a unique idea, but he wanted an organization that was going to pay as much attention to the land and the stream as they did the house and the collections, because he knew any historic organization would focus and be more than grateful to get the house and the collections. But he was really worried about what was going to happen to nature around the house. And that's why he chose a nature conservancy to take care of the building. So tours began in the spring of '64. We've had, I believe, over 6 million visitors by this point. And we, a little over a year ago, along with 7 other Frank Lloyd Wright sites, became a World Heritage Site, which was a huge deal, something that had been in the works since the early 1990s, actually. and it's something that we're quite proud of. Now, today, Fallingwater does remain closed for tours of the interior. We closed March 15th and reopened the site on June 13th, but the grounds only. So we are giving guided grounds tours, or you can also purchase a grounds ticket if you want to walk around the exterior on your own. But at this point, we are not doing any tours of the inside, and we will not be for the rest of this season. So these virtual programs are something that are really important to us and something that we enjoy doing a great deal. So with that, I am concluding that part of the presentation, but I am more than happy to answer any questions that you have.
There are some questions in the chat, which we will go through now. If you have questions, please put them into the chat box, and I will make sure that Amy is asked the question. So the first question is, did Frank Lloyd Wright consult with anyone to plan the engineering for constructing the house?
Yes, he did. Wright had his own engineers within the Taliesin Fellowship. So Wes Peters, and who became Wright's son-in-law, he married Wright's stepdaughter, Svetlana, was one of the engineers involved at Fallingwater. He was a graduate of MIT, and also Mendel Glickman were the two staff at Taliesin who worked on Fallingwater.
How did the water actually affect the building? Like if the falls froze, did that do something to the structure of the house?
That's not been a huge issue. Bear Run is a small stream. I think over 5 miles, it drops like 1,200 feet, so water moves out of it quickly. Does it come up? Will it flood? Yes, it doesn't happen frequently. We had a flood in 2017. It didn't do damage to the building in terms of, well, let me back up and say that where we had some issues with was not with water coming into the house, but with like tree roots, branches, a boulder washed loose from upstream and did some damage. That's more where we can run into trouble, is debris coming down. So we really try to work at keeping the stream free of that. Flash floods are something that don't happen frequently. I think the last major one that we'd had was in the mid-50s.
Has it been used for private events, weddings, and?
Not weddings, a few special things. We've had a few corporate events, but that doesn't happen frequently at all. It's difficult. We have the original furniture collection, and we have the Kaufman's art collection inside, and we don't have ropes and barriers around it. That's what Edgar Jr. had wanted. He felt people couldn't understand the space if they couldn't move around in it. But it also means that it's challenging to preserve it. And offering events like that make it even more so if you're offering food and drink and things like that.
Right, right. How is the house heated and or cooled? Is it a modern system?
It has an oil-fired boiler. There's and hot water radiators in the main house and also the guest house. There's a boiler down in the basement. I think we're on maybe our 4th boiler, I think, at this point. I remember the original one. It filled almost the entire space that it's in. It was huge. They've gone down in size considerably. It's not cooled. We often wish it was in the summer, but it does not have air conditioning.
The furniture, like in many of Frank Lloyd Wright's houses, is low. It's low furniture. So did people find it difficult to sit on it, get up from it? I remember Taliesin West also had pretty low built-in furniture. So
that might depend on what age and what part of your life you're in. I don't know that I would have thought so in my 20s and 30s. Getting down on the floor if I wanted to sit on those stools was a problem. It's a little different now. My knees are not as are a lot more stiff than they used to be. I don't really find that our couch is that low. I don't notice, but like if you're going to get down on one of those low stools on the floor, that's a little different. Yeah. But everything was built to the scale of the house. The ceilings are lower. The house is also built to the scale of the falls. So those rock ledges, there's a certain amount of space between them. Wright based the ceiling heights on the scale of the space between the rock ledges. And therefore, the furniture has to be in scale with those ceiling heights. So it kind of all works together.
The floors that you showed us in one of the very first pictures, is that rock from the surrounding area?
Yes, that all came from the quarry. It's also the sandstone. The floors have a liquid wax on them, so they are sort of sealed, which makes them a little easier to clean. The terraces are not.
Did Frank Lloyd Wright visit once the house was complete, and what did he think about it?
He definitely came in 56 because Edgar Kaufman Jr. had invited him to come after there had been a significant flood, and he wanted Frank Lloyd Wright's opinion on some things. And he may have come back to visit when Edgar and Lillian were here because they were remained good friends with Edgar, or remained good friends with Frank Lloyd Wright. We don't really have any record of any negative comments or really even a whole lot of positive comments that he made. It's just not something we're very much aware of anything that he said specifically. I can tell you that when asked what his favorite building was, he said the next one. He never commented that Fallingwater was his favorite. But I've not even ever read in quotes or things that Wright has said anything really specific about Fallingwater.
So his son, the Kaufman's son, was also an architect?
No. In fact, when he went to Taliesin, he told Frank Lloyd Wright he had just returned from Europe where he had been studying painting. And a friend said, you know, there's an autobiography by this architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, and he's talking about an American architecture. It's a new book. It had just come out in 1932, and I think you might be interested in it. And when he read it, he wanted to go to Wright School. Taliesin was also brand new. It started in 32. And so he went out and he told Frank Lloyd Wright that he didn't plan to study architecture, but he wanted to spend some time there immersing himself in Wright's work and life. And I think he was there roughly about 6 months, and then realized that, you know, he wasn't there for the same reasons that the other students were. He wasn't intending to go into architecture, and Fallingwater was under construction, and so he came back to Pittsburgh.
So did he help in any way in designing or building the house, since he had a little bit of an interest?
Oh yeah, they were all involved, and I often think that it must have been challenging for the contractor because Edgar Sr. was excited about the building and interested in civic planning. Edgar Jr. was involved in making suggestions. Edgar Sr. had men from the department store kind of acting as project managers. Frank Lloyd Wright had young 20-something apprentices out on site trying to manage the project, and the poor contractor, I think, often got caught in the middle between everyone's suggestions and ideas. But yes, Edgar Jr. did contribute several ideas.
Did the total cost of the house come in on budget?
Oh, no. The initial, when they first talked to Wright, they were talking about maybe $30,000 for just the main house. Now, by the time they finished the main house, it had probably come in somewhere around $80,000. And then by the time they added the guest house, totaled up the furniture cost, added Wright's commission, everything was $155,000.
How much would the house be worth today if it was up for sale, do you think? Or is there no? There's
no value on it. Yeah, it's a one of a kind. It's irreplaceable.
And that's the interesting thing about, I guess, Frank Lloyd Wright Frank Lloyd Wright's work is that there are lots of commonalities between all of the houses that he designed, but everything is actually very unique. And I guess that's based on where he actually built it, because he tried to use that environment to design the spaces.
Yes, and based on what those specific clients that hired him wanted and expected, or at least what he thought they wanted. But anyway, it can often make it somewhat difficult to resell because it was built for a specific set of needs, and those may or may not translate to a new owner.
Did he always also design the furniture for his houses?
As much as possible, but by the 50s especially, Wright was really busy. And so he might design maybe a built-in banquette, maybe a couple of built-in pieces, some built-in shelving, maybe a table. And then it wasn't uncommon for him to refer the clients to purchase pieces from his Henredon line of furniture that he had designed. Or in another case, there's a small Frank Lloyd Wright house south of Fallingwater for the Hagans. It's called Kentucky. They knew the Kaufmans, and they ended up talking to Edgar Kaufman Jr., and Edgar Jr. recommended Nakashima and some other designers that had been used for pieces at Fallingwater. And that was a similar thing there, where Frank Lloyd Wright had designed the banquette, a dining room table, and said, okay, you know, go pick out freestanding chairs and things from Henredon. And they really didn't like the look of the Henredon pieces, and so worked with Edgar Jr. to find things that would work well there.
What's your favorite part of the house? Do you have a favorite part?
Oh no, hi, it's your husband, Brian.
I think the third floor, it's the top level of the building, and I've always enjoyed the study in that space, because when you're in that room, you're up with the tops of the trees, and you get the sense of being in a tree house almost. One whole wall is glass, and you have this incredible view looking downstream below the falls. It's either that or the master terrace, which I also really enjoy too. It's kind of hard to pick a favorite, but those are probably the two spaces I enjoy the most.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I just got thrown off thought. Noises. I share a space with my husband. So. I don't know that we have any other questions in the from the audience. If we have any, please send them in the chat box. So you don't expect to open the actual house until 2021 for tours, is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we will not be opening the house, the inside, for this year. And 2021, we don't have a date for opening yet. That still remains questionable. I am hoping we'll open sometime next year, but I don't know when.
Madeline, if you have a question, you need to type it in the chat box, please. I can't unmute everybody. Let's see. I think Madeline has a question. You know, people don't stay necessarily. Go ahead, Madeline. I'm sorry, Amy.
That's okay.
Okay. I think they're having some technical issues. I'm sorry. I keep losing my train of thought. Madeline, if you have a question, please go ahead and ask it.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to know about the stairs. What are the stairs like? Are they like winding stairs? Are they straight? Because there's 3 different levels.
There are no winding stairs. No, they're straight and they're stone. There are no like applied handrails, but what happens is that the walls that line the stairs are also stone, and they have the stick outs on them, and they make perfect handholds as you go up and down, but they're not winding.
So the houses, like many of his houses, are not handicap accessible. Is that correct?
Correct. Although he did design, and I think I just lost the name of it. Laurent, yes, the Laurent House for a gentleman who was a paraplegic. And it was all planned so that exactly to his needs. And that was, gosh, I don't remember the year, 50s, I think it was 1950s. It's now open to the public too. So if you look up Laurent, the Laurent House.
Yes, we've been trying to get a tour. So
Oh, okay.
we've been all over the country touring Franklin Wright houses. Somebody was inquiring about the visiting artist residencies. Can you talk a little bit about that?
They've just started again. So in 1968, I believe, was our first, at that point it was a scholar in residence, and that's when this program began. It was a program that the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and Edgar Kaufman Jr. wanted to put in place, where they had hoped that either a scholar or an artist would come out and perhaps stay in Fallingwater for a period of time and work. And our very first scholar was Roger Torrey Peterson, who does the Peterson Field Guide. So if you're familiar with the bird field guides, the flower field guides, he worked at Fallingwater, I think it might have been maybe 3 weeks, maybe a little bit longer, one winter while the house was closed. My father was actually a naturalist for the Conservancy during that time, and got to meet him and was very, very excited. But after Roger Torrey Peterson, of course, I was only a year old at that point, and I'm not quite sure what all the policies were and what all the thinking was, but they decided not to continue the program for many years until it's, I think, been about 3 or 4 years ago. I believe Andrew was our first. Was he our first? I think. The photographer Andrew Keeledge, I think, was our first when we started the program again. So he was a photographer. We have had 2 photographers, actually. We have also had fiber artists. We have had, I don't work directly with the program any longer, so I'm trying to remember who all they have. But I believe on our website there is some information about applying. I don't think Andrew was our first artist, and now I don't remember who was. Nicole, she was a MacArthur grant, and I just forgot her last name. I'm sorry. I should have had a list of those ready.
I posted a link to your website earlier in the program. It's in the chat, so people can check out your website if the information is there.
Now,
I
the one thing
early. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. They don't stay, the artists or scholars do not stay in Fallingwater currently when they come. We have on-site housing that they stay in, and they're usually here for maybe a week or 2, maybe 10 days. And often their projects are then continued off-site when they leave. But yeah, so.
So now, see, you need just a minute to get back at your train of thought. You've been with Fallingwater for a really long time, as you said at the beginning.
Half my life.
How did you come to work for Fallingwater? What's kept you all these years? You know, in the generation sort of that we've grown up in, people hop from job to job, you know, every couple of years. So I'm personally curious about the draw for you. What's the thing that keeps you and inspires you to continue?
Sure. When I started here, I honestly didn't know anything about Fallingwater. I never had the opportunity to come here as a high school student or a young elementary student, even though I grew up living 7 miles south of the house. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really passionate about our local students coming here now, because they need to have an understanding of what's in their own backyard. But I came because there was an advertisement for, I believe it was for tour guides is what I applied for. And there was public speaking was one of the sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Public speaking was mentioned as being something you would need to be experienced with, and that was something I enjoyed. So I thought, well, this might make a good summer job for a couple of years, and I just fell in love with it. I also came because I knew of my late father's background with the Conservancy, so I actually knew more about the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy than I ever did about Fallingwater itself. So I kind of came out of some curiosity for that background as well. And then I fell in love with the ability to continue learning. I've had the opportunity to travel, to meet some wonderful people over the years, scholars and artists, and work with a great staff. We're very, very close. My husband working here was something I was really very proud of too, working in the preservation department. So it's a place that I just never could really imagine leaving. And I like getting the opportunity to teach other people about Fallingwater and to speak about something that I'm really passionate about.
Well, it certainly comes through. I mean, we've done quite a few of, I mean, we've probably visited 10 or 12 Frank Lloyd Wright sites. So it's evident that you love what you do, and you're very proud of the property and sharing the information with the community. And we hope that once we get back to whatever normal will be, sooner rather than later, that people who've joined us for this call will maybe we'll get a JCC Chicago trip together to go out to Pittsburgh and check out Fallingwater and some of the other great sites, or they'll travel out there on their own. But this has been really, really exciting, and I'm really grateful that you have joined us today. We appreciate it. We've got all kinds of comments in here about how beautiful the house is and thanking you for the great information. Oh, someone wanted to know if you could rent the guest house.
I wish.
I'll take that's a no then, I guess, huh? Not on Airbnb. Let's see, I just got yeah, I mean, everyone's just really grateful, you know, with us, with everybody just being stuck at home. It's really a nice way to break up the day and see something that you might not have had the opportunity to see. So Amy, thank you so much for joining us. We're really grateful for your time and your expertise. Everyone else, thank you for joining us today for this special visit to Fallingwater. Please visit jccchicago.org. Tonight we kick off our social justice series with a conversation with the Institute for Nonviolence Chicago. You can find more information about that on our website at jccchicago.org. We've got more film discussions, more Frank Lloyd Wright visits coming up in the coming weeks. So for everyone who celebrates Yom Kippur, please have an easy fast. The agency wishes you a happy and a healthy new year. And again, thank you everyone for joining us. Be well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.